Hey guys, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new McKinley Dixon record, Beloved Paradise Jazz. McKinley Dixon is at an interesting point in his career at the moment. I mean, as someone on the underground of rap without the veteran status of someone like Billy Woods or Makami, for example, it kind of feels like Dixon is still trying to carve his own niche within the music industry as a whole, and that can, of course, result in a very beautiful thing, as it means that anybody willing to pay attention to his output right now is basically witnessing artistic metamorphosis firsthand. After making a fairly major breakthrough in 2021 with his excellent record For My Mama and Anyone Who Looked Like Her, as well as appearing on the highly praised 2022 hardcore album Diaspora Problems by Soulglow, a fantastic and highly recommendable record, it kind of felt like Dixon was starting to finally find a way for himself to stake his jazz-based poetry and traditional writing-infused style into the musical landscape as we know it. It seems like he's just been on an uphill trajectory for quite some time at this point, and honestly, because of that, I had relatively high expectations for this record. It goes without saying for any artist who's constantly showing more and more promise with each passing release. But at the same time, I wasn't expecting to love this album, or anything like that. I was just hoping that it would be good and deliver some excellent lyricism, as well as some solid, albeit abstract instrumentals, which is about what I've come to expect from McKinley Dixon, as has most of his fanbase at this point. And instead, it was something entirely different. Beloved Paradise Jazz manages to take some of those aforementioned influences related to prose and to jazz and take them to a distance that, even by the fairly high standards now set by Dixon himself, feels kind of baffling, genuinely impressive, and shocking in the best way possible. Very few rappers can actually add in traditional prose into their own music in the same way that McKinley Dixon does. I mean, obviously, traditional writing, for lack of a better term, is not something that's rare in music across any genre, but it can be difficult to pull that off correctly, and generally speaking, when artists do pull it off well, it's often in the form of pointless interludes that don't really set the tone of the album per se, or generally speaking, aren't really that important in the context of the album as a whole. Beloved Paradise Jazz, on the other hand, kicks off immediately with a snippet of the Toni Morrison classic Jazz from 1992 with a phenomenal, emotional, and genuinely striking reading from Hanif. And that immediately sets the tone for this record. It is, in fact, the definitive moment of this album in a very strange way, an album opening interlude that really defines the entire listening experience, as it immediately, again, drenches the entire record in this sort of classic feel. And I don't mean classic in that sort of Shakespearean ye olde English sort of way. No, I mean it in more of a classic important kind of way. Like, you listen to this record and you feel as if it's important. And it's not necessarily to say that that importance is self-defined, it doesn't have an air of self-importance about it, it just feels like this is something that's essential to listen to. And while you could, again, argue that that is in part because of the fact that, well, it begins off with Toni Morrison, one of the greatest writers of the entire 20th century, but at the same time, you could also just argue that that's just a part of it, and that Dixon takes that influence into his own style as well. Look, if you're a McKinley Dixon fan, it shouldn't be that shocking to hear a lot of classic authors and classic writers being featured in his music. For example, the aforementioned 2021 record For My Mama and Anyone Who Looked Like Her featured a song called To Make a Poet Black, which is a fan favorite. It's essential to the development of that record as a listening experience, so on and so forth. But more importantly, that also samples some work from J. Saunders Redding, an incredibly impactful author. The point that I'm trying to make here is that Beloved Paradise Jazz is largely in debt to a lot of classic black authors, and authors that are important to the development of black people and black culture in the context of American literature, in a time where a lot of black artists in general were underrepresented in mainstream arts. These were people that completely flipped that on its head, or at least partially did, contributing some of the most important pieces of American literature of the entirety of the 20th century as we know it. These are things that greatly influenced Dixon as an individual, as a musician, as a songwriter, etc., etc. And it's arguable that this record is the best example so far of him developing these influences while also mixing them in with his own particular brand. That being said, Beloved Paradise Jazz is a little bit different in comparison to his past releases, at least. This record is different in the way that rather than seeing Dixon come across as someone who takes influence from a number of very important writers, he comes across as more someone who is just being possessed by those writers instead, as if he's someone who is now one of those writers rather than just someone who studies them. I mean, really, the songwriting here is just absolutely phenomenal in every way that it possibly could be. Every single track here, for the most part, really has songwriting that ranges from smirk-inducingly clever to genuinely beautiful and actually kind of striking at times. Run, Run, Run features the lyrics, "Nights on the car hood, laid out crucified, grew much more from the love that you provide, standing on stage, hold back both teary eyes." And that's just a pretty perfect example, I would say, of what he's capable of from a lyrical standpoint. I mean, I don't really think I need to discuss why that's great. That's just a beautiful lyric and one of many found throughout this album. It kind of baffles me in a way. It's stunning. I mean, it's songs like Run, 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 it's songs like Tyler Forever, it's songs like Sun, I Rise, that are kind of amazing in the way that they manage to find this perfect balance, this perfect medium between the kind of writing that you would expect from a Pulitzer Prize-tier poet and just an everyman doing his absolute best to capture his own personal experiences. I mean, the type of imagery that Dixon conjures up manages to be nearly romanticistic at times, but then again, it's also constantly brutally transparent in how it depicts his own type of introspection and the manner in which he goes about that. The cut dedicated to Tarfeather especially has some lyrics in the first verse where McKinley seemingly just sort of sums up, I guess you could say, his own personal view on fame, popularity, and his own place in the music industry at the moment. It's pretty interesting. The song starts out with a discussion of his newfound popularity via the analogy of a king, and then he eventually states, "Wasted this life rapping, hope it all wasn't in vain. I take a walk through the garden, flowers don't know my name, but they still listen, I think I like it like that." And again, I think that that's honestly some of the best songwriting I've heard all year so far. And I mean, hey, there have been countless musicians throughout history who have conveyed a message about how their message is more important than they are as a personal public figure or public persona. It's not a rare thing to do. People across all genres of music have done it time and time again for practically decades at this point, ever since the advent of celebrity culture. But at the same time, the manner in which McKinley goes about doing it is just very him, for lack of a better term. Throughout that entire song, and throughout the entire record for that matter, Dixon is just so wrapped up in a style that feels very equivalent to many of the classic writers that he cites as influences, that it just makes something that is entirely his own. It's just completely unique in every way. I genuinely do not think you can get an experience from a lyrical standpoint like this out there unless it's by McKinley Dixon. Maybe it wasn't his intention, or at least not his primary intention on Beloved Paradise Jazz, but it genuinely often feels like McKinley Dixon is being possessed by many of his influences, many of the important black writers throughout history that he has sampled, or taken notes from, or taken quotes from for the sake of his own music, while still molding the guidance of those aforementioned individuals that came before him into something uniquely personal that still represents him before anything else. Lyricism aside, McKinley Dixon is also a strong performer, and he has a very solid presence throughout the entirety of his latest record. In the past, the main selling point for McKinley Dixon's discography has largely been his poetics and his odd but still unique style of lyricism, albeit in the vast sea of often abstract hip-hop, but nonetheless, he still always stood out in his own way, making that, like I said, the primary selling point for much of his music in the past. However, Beloved Paradise Jazz sees Dixon just really improve behind the mic, something that I'm actually really glad to see. I mean, don't get me wrong, those idiosyncratic lyrics and that very unique style of writing is still here, as I've already depicted for you well enough, I would hope, but at the same time, the most important improvement here, at least, is that McKinley Dixon just sounds so much better as an MC, better than he ever has before, arguably. I mean, he's got a lot of variety going on here. His flows vary from track to track, but they manage to stay equal in quality, and he's not going all over the place in every single song every 10 seconds like someone like JID would, but at the same time, he doesn't need to do that. He just needs enough charisma to get through the entire record, and he has more than enough of that in the first place. He already did in the past. He's just improving upon that even more, and it's a great thing to see, as it only increases the quality of what was already going to be a pretty great album. Whereas some of his past releases have felt more like a poet standing on stage and reading some poetry, albeit great poetry, Beloved Paradise Jazz feels more like McKinley Dixon putting on a very elaborate stage production and then running around on songs like Tyler Forever as the most deranged and amazing beat poet that you've never heard. It's a really exciting record because of that. Plus a number of great features ranging from the absolutely amazing Guy Squavara to Teller Banks and Celine Hayes just only add to the already consistent greatness of the performance work that's found here. The instrumentation here also feels significantly more lush than what you might expect from Dixon if you are familiarized with his back catalog up to this point, but then again, the jazz influences that have pretty much been with him since day one, see albums like 2016's Who Taught You to Hate Yourself, are still here, and they are still just as important as they ever were, if not actually more important. This is especially seen on the album's closing title track, which ultimately builds up into this swirling, laid-back jazz instrumental with some great vocal work from Miss Jalen Brown, and even an atmosphere-appropriate children's choir. Do you know how good of a song you have to make me be okay with a children's choir being in it? There's like 2 other musicians that can do that, probably, maybe, and apparently McKinley Dixon's a third. This is all, of course, compared to some of the more minimalistic moments and some of the more even acoustic moments on previous records from Dixon. It's within the same ballpark, of course, but it's different enough that it feels like a slight reinvention at the very least. The live jazz instrumentation that's found throughout the entirety of this album almost feels sort of adjacent to some of the experimental lush jazz coming out of the UK jazz scene right now, and I sort of love it for it in a way. McKinley Dixon is the perfect performer to MC over this particular style of instrumentation, and it manages to translate incredibly well into instrumentals to back him up. While he maintains his experimental style, and that includes experimental instrumentals, McKinley Dixon and the soundscape that's being built here do not clash whatsoever, and I mean that in the best way possible, because it ultimately results in something that's just about as flawlessly executed from a conceptual standpoint as it possibly could have been. McKinley Dixon really does feel like his own beast in the context of underground rap in the current moment, at least. He often comes across as ambitious, yet at the same time he's grounded in his influences, ultimately leaving something rooted in important voices of the past, while also creating something entirely fresh and brand new for music today. Very, very few rappers out there today are capable of analyzing themselves and the cultural themes found here in the same way that McKinley Dixon does throughout the entirety of this record's fairly short runtime. It barely cracks 28 minutes, and it still manages to feel like a much longer, yet extremely impressive listen. Seeing as his career is still relatively young, all things considered, Beloved Paradise Jazz is obviously visible artistic evolution. I mean, you can see it if you just go back to listen to one of his records from a handful of years ago at this point, and honestly, there just kind of doesn't seem to be anyone quite like McKinley Dixon out there right now, and just based on this record alone, the consistency of the quality of it, the uniqueness in terms of the lyrical content, and the way that the jazz-based instrumentation is executed, as well as some of the slightly more harsh-sounding moments found throughout, it all just kind of feels as if that isn't going to change anytime soon. Like there isn't going to be a McKinley Dixon copycat, not for a lack of trying, but for a lack of ability to copy him in a successful way, at least. I'm going to give this record 4.5 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.